also a bit related to a conversation I was involved in with Tse, one of the PhD students at your school. So I'm very glad to be here today and to present you some insights from my research. Actually, I don't have to add much to how Christoph introduced me. So I worked with architects for 5 years at the Università della Svizzera Italiana, which is the Italian university in Switzerland. And now I'm back at the social anthropology unit, but I see myself located actually between both disciplines. So you mentioned I'm currently working on a project related to the circular economy in building construction. If you want to learn more about that project, go and check out the website. I will not really engage with that project today because I haven't really worked a lot with visual methods for that project. So I rather go back to the research I did before. For 10 years, I've been on and off in China doing ethnographic research in different cities. So during my studies, I worked on my MA thesis in the city of Beijing. Then I moved to the Northwest, where I did research in Urumqi and Aksu, two cities not really on the radar here in Europe. It's a multi-ethnic area inhabited by both Muslim Uyghur inhabitants, but also Han Chinese. So there I mainly engaged with the multi-ethnic use of urban spaces. Because research was not possible anymore in that region after 2015-16, I moved out of political reasons. Maybe you've heard about many Uyghurs being prosecuted for being terrorists and being incarcerated. So it was very difficult for me to continue doing research there in order not to do harm to my research participants and collaborators. So I moved to the southwest of China and did my last project in China in Chongqing, where I mainly engaged with climate, architecture, and the city. So this is just to make you aware that I will refer to all these places throughout my presentation, but I will less refer to my research that I did in Europe. So where do I come from? I really work a lot with ethnography. As a social anthropologist, this is our core discipline. And I think ethnography is really valuable, and you may have experienced it in your own projects that I already could look a bit through in the shared folder. You may have learned already that ethnography means to explore not only what people say, but also what they do. So less than only interviewing people and hearing their discourses about certain issues, ethnography enables us to also observe and engage with their practices. So here an example which shows that very well. During 2015, I was invited by a colleague of mine to live in her apartment in Beijing. It was a very hot summer, temperatures of 35, 40 degrees. It was an Uyghur colleague, and she always emphasized, we Uyghurs, we are used to the heat because we have lived in the desert all our lives, so we don't use the air conditioning. But then, when I lived in her home, it happened very often that she was sitting under the running air conditioner and she was working on her things. She was also a researcher and she was enjoying the cool air coming out of it. So what do we make out of these challenges that arise when we observe these practices that actually don't comply with what people say? It's not that people are lying, but it's just that they maybe see themselves in other ways than when they act. So ethnography, in the sense of Signe Howell, for me, it always brings astonishing results. She wrote that anthropology is a discipline of amazement, knowledge, and other people's lives obtained. Sorry, I have to move you a bit so I can read it. So, knowledge of other people's lives obtained during ethnographic fieldwork never ceases to astonish, even stupefy the ethnographer. So much of what is taken for granted, what is considered to be natural and right, is very far from the case. At the same time, the ethnographer discovers that so much is also common across space and lived culture. This results in an appreciation of both difference and sameness. As anthropologists, I think we are constantly confronted with these challenges and also the maybe contradicting results that we gather in ethnographic fieldwork. And I think we also have to show that in our visual representation that the world is never as smooth as it seems at first sight. So what am I going to talk about today? I will really give a brief introduction into architectural ethnography, a bit where I situate myself. I'm not really coming from visual studies, but really I'm interested in the material culture of architecture from a socio-anthropological view. I will briefly talk about a recent project, a special issue that I co-edited with Dennis Zuev, The Spectacle of the Chinese City, Visual Approaches to Urbanization. And the main part of the presentation will be about ethnographic fieldwork and developing a visual language. I will bring a lot of examples from my own research, but also from other researchers. I even included some of your projects into the presentation where they fit. And yeah, if we have time, but I think the timing is very generous, I can also say a few words about mapping and walking, because that's a practice I engaged a lot with. And I can present two projects where I combined visual data with audio files. Also, if you have questions in between the presentation or the slides, you are always welcome to interrupt me, or maybe Christoph, if you see something popping up in the chat, you can also tell me because I don't have the chat open now. So I will not really have a big conclusion, but I will have one last sentence to say about what fieldwork can bring to research. So, architectural ethnography or architectural anthropology. Actually, the field is rather anthropology where I situate myself, but the method is rather ethnography. It's a field that has developed in anthropology rather at the margins. There were maybe two very or most cited studies in anthropology are probably the ones by Pierre Bourdieu and Claude Lévi-Strauss. So they already early engaged not only with how people were organized, how kinship was organized, or what religious practices people had, but they really also started to map the houses and the space distribution in the house. Pierre Bourdieu focused a lot on male-female spaces, while in Claude Lévi-Strauss' study on the Bororo villages in Brazil, he rather also looked at the kin relations and who has to move to which houses, how is the village socially organized. So in general, I think we can say that architecture gives us really a lot of insights also into the social organization of people. As Janet Carsten and Stephen U. Jones said, if people construct houses and make them in their own image, so also do they use these houses and house images to construct themselves as individuals and groups. So that's what I really took on from my early research, that we can never look at the built environment and the social life separate from one another, but we really have to think of them as constituting the social world together. And I here make a big jump, and that's what I try to do in my own research. Here, for example, in these oasis cities in the northwest of China, there was a lot of urbanization going on, a lot of new houses emerged, a lot of old houses have been destroyed, and I will talk a bit about the spectacle later, but there is this visual spectacle in urbanization processes, really the big scale transformations in the cities. And these transformations, they are also very much present in residents' discourses and practices. But my informants, they rarely speak about urban space being transformed, but they really specifically refer to the introduction of new architecture and built structures when they talk about urban transformations. So they would really mention specific house types that disappear and that have made their lives significant. These visible contours of the city, they are describable aspects of a rapid transformation because residents also position themselves socially, economically, and ethnically through them, through these physical transformations. One example is related to I will take the ethnic positioning here as an example. So many of my Uyghur informants, they used to live in small single-story courtyard houses, and they really related a lot of their lives with these houses. So for example, related to climate aspects and thermal material culture, one of my interviewee, Adelaide, she said, this courtyard was so pleasant, especially in summer. The house was built out of a mixture of mud and cement, and then we added some tiles to the outside as decoration. The thermal mass of the house guaranteed a pleasant indoor temperature in summer and winter. Last year, it got demolished to make way for a multi-story building. So in this courtyard house, there are also a lot of family stories stored. They are really stored in these materials. And when these houses get replaced by high-rise buildings, then also the social relations and the family relations are reorganizing because for example, the spaces are different. I also saw that some of you engaged with this transformation or with living in high-rise buildings. So yeah, spaces make something with the people who live in them. So to come back to the spectacle and the special issue that I recently co-edited with Denis Zuev, here you see the list of articles that were included in the special issue. I can also share the slides later, so if one of them is of interest to you, then of course you can look it up. Our aim was really to look at Chinese urbanism as a visual phenomenon, but also what we wanted to do was to look at behind the visible spectacle. Especially in Europe, we often only see these spectacular images of Chinese urbanization, but we rarely learn about the stories of people and their everyday lives that unfold related to that transformation. In our introduction article, we tried to define a bit what that spectacle of the Chinese city is, and we came to two interesting publications. Guy Debord, he said that the spectacle is capital accumulated to the point that it becomes images, which I thought was very, it was very much what happened in China with the economic transformation. Also, the cities transformed through all these investments, and the capital really accumulated in these spectacular images of cities. But then Max Woodworth, he looked more at the counter spectacle. He's a human geographer, and he looked beyond the physical walls of the Chinese city, and he outlined that this enables us to also see the challenges that Chinese society is facing. Like the spectacle may distract us from the high level of political control that often happens in Chinese cities. Then we don't really hear a lot about the relocation of urban residents from their homes. Also the environmental consequences of this urbanization processes do not get talked about a lot when we see the spectacle, and also the discourse of the Chinese government that city growth is also a representation of people's better living circumstances. But then, of course, there is also surveillance and touristification. We see that in many cities, like in Kashgar, which is also located in the northwest of China, we see a touristification of urban spaces. So it's mainly a spectacle that is being created, a heritage that is being staged to show a certain local identity, which may not exist anymore, or which is actually destroyed to make way for new buildings. So there are all these challenges and also things happening behind the spectacle that we were interested in and that the different articles in the special issue are talking about. Yeah, there are some things that we highlighted in the introduction as well. So we really looked at construction and deconstruction. We looked at narratives and materialities from socialist to capitalist city. What does it mean in the everyday lives of people? And we looked at the political and economic impact on shaping cities versus the response of residents. What we also tried to do, but something that is a bit more difficult in textual or visual publications, is to be attentive to our non-visual senses in the texts. So we also try to encourage our authors to be attentive to soundscapes, tasting, smelling, and touching, because these are things that ethnographic approaches can assess very well. And then a last goal we had with this special issue was also to look a bit beyond the usual suspects, like beyond the Eastern Chinese cities of Beijing, Shanghai, or Guangzhou, Shenzhen, but really also to show how the spectacle of the Chinese city unfolds in cities like Macau, Wuhan, Chongqing, Aksu, or Hangzhou. So to look a bit beyond the eastern coast. So this was a bit like where I come from or where I situate myself. So I do a lot of research at the intersection of anthropology and architecture. And with this special issue in visual studies, we really also looked at visual aspects. But I realized that in the articles that I gave or that I shared with you, actually the visual representation of the material does not really come out. So I try to gather a lot of examples how ethnographic fieldwork can be visually transferred into a publication. Just for those who are interested also to learn a bit more about the challenges of anthropological fieldwork, I recommend you to check out this project by my colleagues here at the University of Fribourg. It's a multimedia story on how to create anthropological knowledge. It's not really related to visual studies or architecture, but it's really broader. What if ethical issues come up during a fieldwork? What happens before and after a fieldwork? So check it out. It's a very nicely made story. I don't know how much you were engaged in learning about ethnography and fieldwork methods, but at the core of ethnographic fieldwork for anthropologists is participant observation. It's like that we engage long-term with our participants in their everyday lives. This can be for weeks, months, or years, really immersing ourselves into the lives and knowing their lives from the inside. So yeah, I mentioned the senses already. They come up very prominently during fieldwork. Here also a link to a movie that I really like by my colleagues Willi Thier and Sanderian Verstappen, The Empty Home. They really show how they ethnographically worked with, especially this woman. She owned an apartment in one of the new houses in Wuhan, but because her work was on the other side of the city, she usually slept in her shop. So the home was actually empty most of the time. Her parents live on the countryside. You read about migration in the article by Xian Zheng. So her parents are not there. She's also not living in the apartment, but the family owns the apartment, but most of the time it's empty. So Willi Sier in the interview tries to find out what this empty home then means for the identity of her interviewee. And it's a very nice and fine-tuned movie about how to conduct interviews and follow our participants in the field. Also doing mundane practices like cleaning the house, which is empty. So it's very contradicting. When we do ethnography, actually, we as researchers are the scientific instruments that we take into the field. So obviously our gender, age, race, or class also influence our position vis-a-vis the interviewed people, and they also provide us different access to information. I always take this example of Sascha Rössler, the professor I was working with. He was male, 10 years older than me, and we conducted 1 week of fieldwork together in Chongqing. I was I was junior to him. I was a woman. So when we went to this house of 2 friends of mine who were around the same age like me, he, of course, got totally different information from them than I would get because our connection was different. I was more their age. I had lived longer in China already. I knew many things. I could ask other questions. So this was quite interesting to see directly in this fieldwork period how we both act and receive different information. So we should always keep that in mind when we gather ethnographic data. Yeah, the ethnographer invests not only professional skills, but also interpersonal skills. Because of course, if you do several months of fieldwork, you cannot leave your personal eye at home, but you take it with you, and it can enable or constrain getting certain data. Maybe there will be some questions also about that related to your field, to your own projects, like how you yourself could get access to certain information and not to other. It also shapes what we write about later on. Yeah, so semi-structured interviews, it has nothing to do with visual methods, but it of course informs what we learn from people. I really enjoy this method because it's not like sitting with someone in an office and holding an interview in a one-to-one situation, but usually I'm going to the places where people work, or I can accompany them in their family life, or we do small trips together. And it's another way of learning about their ideas on a certain topic. So semi-structured interviews also means that I always had certain questions in mind that I would ask most of the people I met in one fieldwork session. And this would then enable me to get different perspectives on the same subject. So you see me here in different situations. I went to, first one is on a cotton field with a cotton farmer. On the second one, I was doing a tourist visit with a friend of a friend whom I encountered. And then I took part of the installation of an underfloor heating in a new apartment. So this was also interesting to see the interaction between the owners of the apartment, the installing person, and there was also a person from the real estate office of that building. So while being there for several hours, I could also learn how they interact with one another, what were the interests or also the knowledge about the technique that they implemented. And that was, very valuable. It was a totally different information than I would get if I would interview each of them separately. And of course, I was especially in the northwest of China, I was using a very mobile ethnography. So I was traveling a lot, and also during travels, you have sometimes several hours sitting next to a person in a bus, and you can use this time to learn more about the person's background. And also, I had very large topics, so I could just ask the people here, where do you live? What is your experience? Where does your family live? Yeah, how do you see the urbanization process in your city, and so on. So these time capsules, when you travel together, they are also valuable to get ethnographic data. So now some visual methods, how you can gather data. So you see some of them is really not my own, but I see the presentation also as an input to give you ideas how other people work and what they map or how they draw and so on. So this I thought was a very interesting study on Valparaiso, that some architects were really drawing the spaces, and it gives you a totally different insight than the photos would do that you see on the right-hand side. I will come back also to the advantages and disadvantages of certain visual methods a bit later in the talk. We also worked a lot with students in Mendrisio at the architecture school, and in one seminar they had to map microclimatic environments. So they were very creative in finding ways. For example, this group of these two students, they were mapping a little slope in the village of Mendrisio, and they really drew the different houses that are there, particularities of the built environment. And then they also added, maybe you can see it here, small points of interest or numbers. And then they would make a very complex assessment of what kind of microclimatic situation existed in these different spots. And you also see that, yeah, there was kind of, the road was kind of going up, the built environment changed, and this also affected the different microclimatic situations in these spots. Drawings, I think, are a very powerful means to represent the built environment. This one is a very chaotic or a very fine-tuned drawing, I would rather say, of the Kowloon walled city in Hong Kong, which was destroyed in the 90s. But you can see through the drawing, it is really possible to have all the details of these houses included and transferred to the person who looks at it. While on the other hand, if you would see a photograph of this Kowloon walled city, it would be much more on the surface. So I think the drawing in that case really has an advantage of the person who draws can show us what she or he wants to emphasize in these built environments, while the photographs, they cannot really do that. I really enjoyed also I looked at the 4 PhD projects that Christoph shared with me that were by people from your school. So I really think photos are also, they are very apt also to tell stories. For example, Zilwa Cheng, she tells these home stories of the people who live in the simulacra cities around Shanghai. Or there was another project by Marco Veneri on these gardens. I call it garden stories. So these photographs tell us garden stories really from a very intimate point of view, even if we don't see the heads of the people who are doing these things, but we are totally and very much into the situation where these hands are doing something with the things, the materials at hand. Photographs can really, oops, oh, I don't see it. Sorry, I have to move something. Ah, okay. Photographs, they have several advantages, but of course they also have some disadvantages. But it's really a snapshot in time. Chung En wrote a whole article on telling stories of the city, walking ethnography, effective materialities, and mobile encounters. And in that article, Chung wrote, in doing so, photographs are not only mobilized as a mode of representing vignettes of the urban streetscape, but also to take seriously the performative power of the photographed objects to provoke openings for imagination. And really this provocation of openings for imagination, I think we saw it very well in this story of images, but I also have a lot of images, or I encountered situations which were visually appealing, but I had no idea. For example, this photo, I didn't know, was it a sleeping place of a street worker, or was it just a place where people would put their waste? It was in between some houses, a rather dark place. So photographs can also, really open our imagination. But photography can also be a research tool. It doesn't always have to be like visually appealing. In Chongqing, I used photography also to see how people adapt the openings of their windows or balconies to different types of weather and climate. This was kind of interesting because for a couple of weeks I lived in the same apartment and I had this building in front of me. So every day I would take a photo in the morning or in the evening, depending on when I thought about taking one. And people always told me, yeah, when the sun is coming out, we would close all our curtains so that the apartment doesn't heat up, because these houses are very poorly insulated. So people really use the closing and opening of windows and curtains to regulate temperature indoors. And through photography, I could also show these practices. For example, on the right-hand side, you see that when the sun is coming out, really most of the curtains are being closed. While in the morning, when it was a bit dizzy, most of the windows were opened, like the curtains were not closed. So photography can also tell us or underline certain findings from conversations. Yeah, one of the examples I can also bring is, I mean, I came to this neighborhood and I lived here for several weeks. And at the beginning, it was just a neighborhood and kind of just an area on the map. But then through time, it became much more like diverse. And I really mapped different climatic places. Also, it was also a research on microclimates within one neighborhood. And through time, I could really say which spaces people use when it's too hot and which spaces they use when it's getting cold. So photography can also help us to get visually insights into a first unknown neighborhood. Another example that I thought was fascinating about microclimates was also done by a student in Mendrisio, and he mapped different places in the city of Milan. You see on the right-hand side two of these smaller images. So for example, the first one, he wrote, around this corner building, several people were stationed on railings from which a light stream of warm air came out. So you wouldn't really guess that from looking at the image, but only his explanation provides information about the microclimatic use of the space. Or the arch, he described that there, sometimes when it's raining, food delivery people would gather under the arch. So that kind of information you can really only get by ethnographically engaging with a city and with a place. You wouldn't know it simply by looking at the map or by listening to what people say. Then, of course, what is a very, I would say, prominent way how to visualize architecture is building surveys or to survey floor spaces. I also copied one example by one of your students, Maria Minic, on the houses in Belgrade. And then I also went quickly through the article that you shared with us by Jingru Cheng and saw that she's also very much working with floor plans to visualize how people use and organize domestic and semi-public spaces. So these are very prominent ways how to visualize architecture. And I also did a couple of floor plans in my own research. In the old times, I was still writing down many things in my field diary. Nowadays, I rather do it electronically. But actually, floor plans, I always drew them while I was visiting people in their homes. And I always did it by hand in a very sketchy form. And only later, I would transform it into a publishable and readable floor plan. So that floor plan here is from Huang Chongshi. He's living in a 3-room apartment in a high-rise building in Chongqing. And I was very interested in how he uses his apartment depending on the season of the year and the temperatures. So he told me, for example, that in summer he's rather sleeping in this room because he has an air conditioner here, and it's somehow, he said, you can better ventilate the room also by natural wind. However, in winter, he would mostly use this room here, close the door, he would sleep here, he would work here. You see him in this small room. So it was easier to heat it a little bit with a small heater, and he would spend most of his life here in this enclosed room. And then the living room, when I entered it was in December, it looked like this, and the window was wide open, although the outdoor temperatures were around 12, 13 degrees. But he just said he doesn't care because inside it will anyway not become warmer because he has no heating. So there are some practices that we would think are a bit strange, but then when we look at his everyday rhythm, we learn that it's really the most feasible to only stay in this small room here. But nevertheless, he always, even at home, he would not take out his jacket and he would have warm indoor shoes so he would not get cold. Many people in Chongqing, they rather go outdoors in winter to move, and at home they would have to wear good clothes so not to get cold. But that's another story. It has to do with the heating system in China, where certain cities above the line, they have a heating system, and cities who are below the heating line, they don't have it. So that's the story of this article, even if I realized that actually the floor plan was not included in the article. But if you want to learn more about the story of the heating and the climate control in Chongqing, then I would recommend you to read that article that I added to the folder. Then something that someone else did, where you can also get some inspiration for how to work with visual data and especially how to involve your research participants. Maybe you know about that project on disobedient buildings. It's from led by Inge Daniels from the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Oxford. And they do research on rather old and a bit decaying buildings. They were doing research during COVID, and they were they were making research packs where they put in postcards, maps, notebooks, disposable cameras, and sound recorders. And then they encouraged their research participants in these flats to take photos themselves, to write about their everyday lives in these apartments, because they couldn't go there. I mean, it was COVID, so the researchers couldn't visit the research participants in their flats. But I think it's actually also a way of doing research by involving research participants in other places. So like giving them the camera and asking them to take images of things that they deem valuable in the context of a certain topic. I saw that also one of you, Alessandra Fasoli, was like really involving research participants through drawings, if I understood the project well. So that first you are doing these different drawings and then you are discussing the drawings together with the people or the children you have drawn. So I think this is also a method of ethnographic research that is valuable to not only record things that we observe and see by ourselves, but also to feed it back to the people we work with and see how they react to it. So I don't know how much time I should still spend. What do you think? I could say I could make maybe 10 more minutes, or what do you think?
That would be lovely, Madlen. I think we're all lapping it up here. So as much as you want to share with us, please feel free to take we have the whole morning, so there's no pressure at all in time.
Okay, because the mapping and walking section maybe also takes 10-15 minutes, and then I have still some audio and visual data combination that I could share with you.
That would be perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So I did a lot of mapping and walking during my own research. So I also try to reflect a bit on that, and I will bring some insights also from other researchers, how they see these practices and also how they visualize their data. One of the studies that really influenced me a lot at the beginning of my PhD was a publication by Hazel Andrews on Mapping My Way, map making and analysis in participant observation. She was doing research in, Mallorca. I wrote it here, in 2 cities in Mallorca, and it was mainly about tourism. But she really went through the main roads of these cities and she mapped or she wrote down every single shop that she encountered along the road. And this then provided her an idea how many restaurants, how many travel agencies, how many other spaces of interest to tourists are there. And she also reflected in that article a lot on the mapping praxis. So she said that although the maps became tools by which I could objectify my field, their actual sketching in the resorts still forms, in my view, part of a phenomenologically based praxis. The act of walking in the field, of embodying the setting, informed the map's initial characteristics. As Ingold and Vergun state, walking is as much a movement of pensive observation, of thinking as you watch and watching as you think, as it is a way of getting around. And that, for me, really opened a whole new view on why we map, because mostly we do not only map to get a visual representation, but mapping itself is a way of gaining knowledge ourselves about a place. Also, if we walk through a place at different times of the day, at different days of the week, in different seasons, we get totally different information about it. So mapping is not only about the result, but also about the practice for us as researchers. Because walking and photographing is rhythmical and it brings our bodies into conversation with the environments we move through. And that's, I think, also the core of ethnographic research. It's not only about how we later visualize the data, but it's really about ourselves and our bodies that get in touch with the environment that we want to talk about or that we want to tell stories about. Another researcher coming more from human geography, Alison Barnes, she also did quite interesting maps of New Basford in Nottingham. And she was, maybe you cannot really read it, but on the left-hand side, she was mapping all the tags and graffitis that she found on the walls. In the middle, I don't remember what she was mapping, but on the right-hand side, she was mapping the different bricks that she could observe on the houses in this area. So this is also a way how you can represent data of especially urban areas. I will not read the quote. I think it doesn't give us a totally new insight. In my own work, I also used mapping to get to know more about urban life. For example, in Aksu, all the people I met, they always said, our city is transforming so fast. High-rise buildings are replacing old buildings. We don't even recognize the neighborhoods if we come back 2 or 3 years later. And I was wondering, how can we visualize this transformation in a map? And I started to map all the construction sites and all the cleared areas in the city center. And then, and through that, you can really see that there are a lot of orange spots in this area. So all these areas are under transformation, and they will transform the visual landscape of the city. So this was a way to visualize what my informants actually always emphasized. In a similar way, I also engaged with the ethnic use of urban spaces. So here you see the small people are where my informants lived. So the yellow ones are the Uyghur residents. The red ones are the Han residents. And many of my interviewees, they always said, the Han people, they live on this side of the city, and the Uyghur people, they live on this side. And they emphasized that there is a clear boundary in the city, that you would live on this side or on this side, depending on your ethnic identity. But when I started mapping where they really live, the image became much more complex. And you can see here, it's not that all the Uyghur people live on the same side and all the Han people on the other side, because in China, it's often the case that your work unit or your company where you work, they would provide you with an apartment or a subsidized apartment in a certain area. So many people would take that offer and get an apartment through their work unit, and they wouldn't really choose where to live, but they would really take where they are offered space. I also tried to map here where the Han shops and the Uyghur shops are. These are the red lines along the street, because also in conversations, people always said, yeah, there is a clear distinction where Han people would go strolling and where Uyghur people would go. And of course, you see a certain division on the right-hand side, a bit more Han spaces, on the left-hand side, a bit more Uyghur spaces. But there is no clear-cut boundary where you could really cut the city through. So visualizing what my people told me, and also walking through all these streets and looking at the street signs, whether they were written in Uyghur or in Chinese, and whether the restaurants offered Uyghur food or Han Chinese food, this also provided, or I transformed this information into maps that really give us a visual image of how the city is organized. I did some more experimental maps during COVID for a project by Louise Ann Wilson. She made a project Walks to Remember During the Pandemic with Memory I Was There. And I did 2 maps about my field material in Chongqing. So here I was mapping or I was drawing encounters with the ventilation heritage of the area where I lived, because I realized that the houses there, they have very different patterns of how they would arrange the bricks of mainly the staircase windows, because often the staircases are not closed, but they are open. It's a very humid climate, so the air can flow through it easier if there are openings. But I realized that these openings are very artistically made in some of the houses I visited. So this was a work that I mainly did based on photographies that I took in the field, and then I tried to locate them on a map. I also did a little map with heating on warming objects, how people would keep themselves warm in the city. And I tried to also show how I would go to these different places through the day. But I mean, it's a bit complex. If you have time, you can once read it. But this was also not only about the result of the map, but actually doing the map also helped me reflect on my fieldwork data and how I would present it in articles as well. I think urban walking is particularly interesting, and I practiced it a lot because it helped me really engage with the physical surrounding that I wanted to research about. And the urban walking is really a bodily engagement. This is partly why in the city the bodily presence of the walker counts for so much. The route is made by and as the person walks. It disappears as soon as the person moves on, although over time it may produce other traces, pedestrian crossings built at popular crossing points, or shops opened to catch passing trade. While in the countryside, you often see where you walk, because you would, for example, walk in the mud or in the sand, you would see your traces. In the city, you don't really see it. So mapping where you have been is a way to visualize what you have seen and with what areas you have engaged. I really like this article by Jo Lee and Tim Ingold on fieldwork on foot, perceiving, routing, and socializing, because it really makes you thinking about walking as a practice in ethnography. Here, maybe not such a nice visual representation of a fieldwork, but nevertheless an interesting way. Wayne Medford, he engaged with the life of a public park, route making, vigilance, and sampling whilst walking. And his aim was really to weave the observable layout of spaces to embodied experiences and life courses within the park's life. So he would also walk through the park in different seasons and different times of the day, and this enabled him to work out the different life rhythms that unfold in this same space. So the body of us as fieldworkers is always present when we do ethnographic fieldwork, and walking is really an embodied ethnography. It's related to sensual and relational practices. Our body interacts not only with the environment, but also with other bodies. Bodies are constantly in a network of rhythms that are sometimes difficult to apprehend through photography. So I think mapping is in that way maybe more apt to show these movements. And yeah, this is another point, but I mean, we could also engage in discussing a bit the photography as a tool of representation, because of course it's also involved in social power relations. So where can we go? What can we take pictures of? It's also related to ethical aspects. So photographs beyond visually enriching our fieldwork experience, they are of course also related to a lot of of ethical challenges. And I think maybe even more than maps, who are more products of our thinking and of our engagement with the built environment. While photographs, also when you take photos of people, you always have to negotiate whether you can show this or not, whether people have agreed or not. This I already mentioned. Repeating the same walk can also generate different impressions. So last but not least, maybe also to provide you some food for thought to combine your visual data with other kinds of data presentation. In my case, I worked at least 2 times with audio. So one project was to combine mapping with audio in the city of Aksu. Again, you see the map with the Han spaces and the Uyghur spaces. And here I added some points on the map where I would provide some soundscapes and reflections on these particular spaces. It was published in the frame of an online exhibition on the exhibition was called Asphalt, Lines and Lives. And different, mainly artists, were representing different urban spaces in Central Asia, and me also looking from the Chinese Central Asia on the topic. I don't know actually if I can put the audios, if you would hear anything. I don't know.
Let me just check whether we need to change a setting here.
But it's no problem. We can also leave it, and people can listen to it on themselves if they have time to get inspired. I mainly took songs, Uyghur songs and Han Chinese songs, and then I spoke some ethnographic vignettes over the soundscapes. So this gives also an idea of how the city space works along different ethnic lines. And then the second project where I combined visuals with audio was a project I did with a photographer, with Katja Jug, here from Switzerland. She also came to Chongqing, and we tried to find ways how to communicate what it means to live in winter in this city without a heating. So she took very artistic photographs, most of them staged. You see here on the top, on the bottom picture, you see 2 people. They are really wrapped in their winter home clothes, and they are in one of these characteristic old buildings. So she really went to find clothes for them, and she dressed them, and she took pictures of them, all with their consent. And later on, I tried to find some audio materials, how to provide insights into how it feels in winterly Chongqing. So if you have time, you can listen to this audio as well. There are different Chinese people and how they express to feel cold. Because in Switzerland, I don't know, in the UK, in Switzerland, we all say brrr when it's cold. But I was very surprised that people in Chongqing use a completely different sound that I cannot share with you, but you can listen to it later on. And I think this combination of visuals with the soundscape provides yet another depth into representing or communicating ethnographic data. Yeah, so I come to my very last slide, because I really want to emphasize that whatever you create, I cannot really read it, I'm sorry, because I have this banner, but I think most of all, fieldwork means developing a cultural competence. So it's really not only about the materials that we collect, but it's about the engagement with the environment, which provides us, the researcher, with a different perspective on our research subject. And Thomas Boren, he once concluded to this point in very nice words, because he said the main material one brings home from the field is not the notes, tapes, or other texts or other evidence. No, it is the cultural competence or the interpretative capacity that one ultimately developed while learning to understand the local life world logic of the people in the place of study. So it's always worth to go somewhere also to get a more sensual approach to the topics we do research about. And with that, I will end. Thank you for your attention. I hope it wasn't too long, and I hope you got at least some insights that you haven't heard before. So I'm happy to discuss now or later, depending on how you want to organize the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madlen.